Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk. I am Shekhar Gupta and my guest today, by far the most eminent and the most doughty human rights campaigner from the subcontinent. I know you don't belong only to the subcontinent anymore, you are a global citizen, but you are by far the most courageous and I would say in some ways the most successful human rights campaigner from the region.
You're being very kind, but I should say I'm a daughter of this region, and therefore it's always a pleasure to be back here.
So, Irene Khan, now Director General of IDLO, you try and make more and more countries law-abiding and follow international law and to basic principles of law. What brings you to India?
What brings me to India is actually...
What offense have we given you lately?
No, it's not actually offense, it's actually opportunity that brings me to India. India is the world's largest democracy. It has a long, proud tradition of rule of law, of an independent judiciary, and there is a lot that India has to offer to the rest of the world in terms of its own legal experience, its own judicial experience, its constitutional protections. I mean, these are issues that are at stake around the world, everywhere, in every region, in every country. And what I hope India will do will offer its experience and expertise to others to learn, to watch, and for India also to play a role on the global stage on issues like rule of law, human rights and justice.
So, what's your advice to government of India now?
My advice to the government was, you have a lot of experience, expertise, there is a tradition of humanitarianism, apply it.
And don't be afraid.
And don't be afraid.
Because if you see debate in India, particularly on some of our what I call as commando comic channels, it's as if we are now being invaded by some 13th century thug from some place in Central Asia.
Well, there will always be people who will try to provoke things, who will get excited about it and so on. The government's role is to be rational, is to be calm, is to look at systems and procedures and apply them. In fact, that's the business in which I am. You know, in my organization, that's what we are teaching governments, strengthening their capacity to deal with issues in a rational way through the rule of law.
So, your native country, Bangladesh,
yes.
They have accepted a lot of Rohingyas, 4.5 lakhs, 500,000.
Yes.
Now for a country which otherwise doesn't have a glowing record on being liberal or on human rights, where between the radical Islamic groups and the government, it's the secular bloggers who are getting slaughtered. How do we reconcile the two? First of all, do you appreciate the point that your government is doing it? Second, why are they doing it? And third, then why don't we see the same big-heartedness with democracy and democratic systems within your country?
Well, you know, in my country, there is a small group, and I deliberately emphasize the small group, who have become extreme in their thinking. Intolerant of others, intolerant of other religions. You mentioned bloggers, but it's not just bloggers. Religious minorities, Hindu priests, Christian priests have also been attacked. So there is this small group of intolerant people who are...
I mean, when tourists, expats.
Yes, expats.
As in that restaurant.
And you know, in the history of this organization, of my country, in the history of my country, we have never had attacks on foreigners. Bangladesh, since it was born, yes, there might have been arguments internally, political violence between political parties, but not with foreigners. For the first time we had that attack, and that attack in that restaurant in Dhaka was horrible. And there was one young Bengali boy whose family I know well, who, Bangladeshi, Muslim, they asked him to leave and he said no. He had come into that building with one young Indian woman and one young American woman, and he said, I'm not leaving my friends behind. Yeah. They killed him. And he stood up for it. And there is a strong movement in Bangladesh in favor of that boy, Farhaz. And everyone is saying, you know...
He's a hero.
He's the hero. He's the one we admire. He's the one who reflects the values of...
So why is the government not reflecting some of those values internally? The government's very tough on the media. It's very tough on NGOs who want to do something. Anything political in your country?
You see, I think in democracies, governments work well when there is a functioning opposition. and when there is a system of accountability. In Bangladesh, unfortunately, we have never really developed that system of democracy, where you have 2, 3, 4 political parties arguing things through.
Hasina has destroyed the opposition now.
Well, the opposition, to some extent, has also destroyed itself.
As it keeps doing here.
Yeah. Whatever happens, you don't have an opposition, and so you have one party basically in parliament. You don't have debates in parliament. You don't have any space for tolerance, and then the government becomes more and more, I would say, restrictive of any other opinion, any kind of criticism. I wouldn't say the entire government. There are still people in the government who are listening and who ought to actually influence the others to say that democracy becomes healthier. The country, it's better for the country to have dissent, to have criticism. It doesn't hurt. It's much better to talk and debate these things, because if you don't debate them, then you will get violence.
Yeah, but the same country then gives refuge to so many Rohingyas that many I see on social media, and I see influential people saying, take away Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel and give it to Hasina.
Well, Bangladesh, you know, they received, I told you in the 90s, I was on the border. At that time, they received 350,000, 3.5 lakhs. Now they have over 4 lakhs. Bangladesh has actually been very generous to these. And you know what happened in this particular case? The government, the central government in Dhaka, had told the border officials, the security, police and so on, to block people coming over. Because for them, the government sees this as Myanmar pushing people out. Myanmar should not push people out. It was the border officials who said, we cannot push back women, children, injured people, old people. They need help. We'll open it up. So that's sort of the inner generosity of people. They opened it, and these people are coming in. I think the really important issue here is Myanmar. Whenever there is a refugee problem, of course the focus is on people coming out, but the solution for the problem lies inside the country. And I think countries like India, like others who have influence on Myanmar, should get together and get Myanmar to accept people back.
That's a violent region. Much before you joined Amnesty also, in 86, 87, I carried out a research project for Amnesty on Chakmas who were similarly being driven out of Chittagong Hill Tract by Bangladesh forces and by Islamic groups at that point. So this is a movie, this is a tragic movie that Bangladeshis have seen before. I mean, from a different end.
That's true. That's true. You know, this is about diversity.
Then it was Muslims killing Buddhists, now it's Buddhists killing Muslims.
You know, you come back to the same issue of how do you build tolerance?
Yeah, two spurs of the same mountain, metaphorically.
Exactly, and how do you build tolerance? This sort of intolerant idea that, you know, I'm right and everyone else has to be wrong, so I've got to dominate them or I have to kill them. That theory, and I think leaders like Aung San Suu Kyi are very well placed to stand up and say, no, that's not the way to behave.
But why is she not doing it?
I think in her own country she is squeezed because of the political system into which political arrangement into which she has found herself, where really, yes, she is the nominal, she's the head without the title, and then she has all these arrangements with the generals and others, and that makes it extremely difficult for her to move. Now, as a person, as an individual, of course, she can take a stand, and I hope she will take a stand. I believe recently she has said that she would like to respect the recommendations that have come from the Kofi Annan Commission, and I think that is the right path to go. Because at the end of the day, you have several 100,000 people inside your country. Maybe they do not belong to the main ethnic group, but as a democratic leader, you have to respect the rights of all.
So where are you on this Nobel debate? Take away Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel. It's a rhetoric, but still.
She is not the first Nobel Prize winner against whom people have said that.
Right.
People said that for Obama when he went back into war again. I don't think prizes can be given and taken away that easily.
Right.
I think public opinion has made themselves felt strongly. That's a big message to Aung San.
But is she coming up to the honor of the Nobel?
You know, if you look at all the people who have received the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, I'm sure you will find some people that should not have got the prize. So there will be differences of opinion. And that's why I would think that the fact that people have called for it is strong enough message to her. To her, yes.
And on Hasina, now Hasina has risen as this great, big-hearted, generous, liberal, South Asian leader who's welcoming refugees with open arms, in spite of having such serious problems in our own country?
Well, you know, Bangladesh is also like India. Bangladesh is a country of very sharp contrasts. On the one hand, Bangladesh, in terms of its social development indicators, has done extremely well.
Much better than India in many areas.
Yes, Hasina's government has improved education, health, people's access to water and sanitation, women's access to employment and empowerment and so on. So there are some very, very good stories to tell. At the same time, we have stories where newspaper editors are being hounded, bloggers are being killed, not necessarily by the government, but certainly the government is the one that we will look to protect them.
Right.
So in terms of protection, they are falling short. So there are all this other side of it. And I think these are all signs of a democracy that still has to mature.
How strong a factor is Islamophobia now? In non-Islamic countries?
Globally?
Globally.
Yes. You know,
globally, and then I will talk about India.
You know, I will say not just now. When I became Secretary General of Amnesty International, the first press release that went out said I was the first Muslim. I was the first woman, but the first Muslim to become the Secretary General of Amnesty. And when I saw it myself, coming out of Amnesty, I was shocked because I had never thought of myself as a Muslim. You know, I'm a secular Muslim. Yes, we all have our religion, but we don't wear it in our heads. But people picked that up. Whenever I went into interviews with journalists and others.
I'm an atheist until anybody I really care for falls sick, or until India is playing in a competitive sporting tournament.
Yes, of course. We all have our cricket
Absolutely.
teams and our soccer teams.
And any other teams. So then I believe in whichever God I can think of.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right. No, but you see, there is something that has happened where people have become scared of Muslims, Islam, you know, scared. And that is very bad. You know, that's very bad. There was a time, and there still is, there's also anti-Semitism. So religion as a factor is an emotive factor, you know, because it's not about being rational. It's an emotional thing. We believe in it or we don't believe in it. We get passionate about it. And then everyone else is seen differently. So I think there is a time for much more of what I would call humanism to come forward. And leaders have a big role to play in this.
And what does the Islamic community do here?
I think I see more and more, and I'm very pleased to say that more and more I see our Islamic leaders, the religious leaders, coming up and speaking against it, saying Islam is not about this. Islam is a religion of peace. You know, the word salam, you know, when we greet each other as Muslims, that's a word of peace. So what is being promoted is not religion. It is actually, they're doing it for political reasons. This is not about religion. They're killing Muslims. There were more Muslims in many of these events that are taking place, attacks.
But frankly, these are Muslims killing Muslims, usually who they think are liberal or not with them.
Yes. So it is not, they're not killing them because they're Muslim. They're killing them because of ideological reasons. You know, you are liberal, you're progressive, you have a different, you eat and drink in a different sort of way.
All religious extremists kill more of their own.
Yes. So it is an ideological.
The Khalistanis in Punjab killed many more Sikhs than they killed Hindus. That's how it works. So this also, I mean, I didn't know about the announcement by Amnesty when you joined, but your tenure at Amnesty, you raised the red flag about some terrible torture that was taking place at that time. The Bagram Air Base, Guantanamo Bay, some others. And you used the G word. You called them the Gulags. And then came the outcry. Not just from the conservative right, but also from the liberal left.
And even within the human rights movement. People picked up, historians tried to correct me.
Ariel Cohen stood up and said, my father was in one of the Gulags. What do you know about Gulags?
Yes, but I think it was the concept I was using. And the concept
And I think you also mentioned Auschwitz at some point.
No, I did not mention Auschwitz. I mentioned Gulag, because what I wanted to convey then was that what is the idea of Gulag? It's not a particular prison. It is you take people there, you put them there, and you forget about them. They disappear. You know, they're there, but you don't care about them. That's what was happening. You know, people were being pulled out and put there and forgotten. I think terrorism.
Now they're at least documented.
They're documented. Things have moved on. Numbers have got reduced as well, and there is more. You know, have access to lawyers and others. But the key issue is that terrorism is a terrible crime. Victims of terrorism have the right to justice like anyone else. They should be tried. These people should be tried. They should be tried, I hope, in open court so that everyone can see how justice is being done to them, and then lock them up.
But the logic at that point was a trial is fine, that will happen later, but let's get as much information out of them as possible, which is not possible in a conventional scenario of conventional lawfulness. So let's make special laws.
Yeah, but you know what? I have spoken to experts, intelligence experts, people who work, for example, in Northern Ireland, intelligence
In fact,
officers.
you went for schooling there, I noticed, very early on, yes.
And I spoke to a gentleman who was head of the military intelligence in Northern Ireland, and I asked him if he had ever tortured anyone, and he said no. And I said, why not? He said, because torture is a terrible way of getting information. When people are under pain, they'll say anything. So very often, the information you get is not the real information, it's the information that the person thinks you want, so that he can...
Well, I've just finished reading a book this size on the Osama bin Laden family, before and after 9/11. It's a very well documented book called The Exile, written by Kathy Scott Clark and Adrian Levy, which mentions some of this, that some of the more skilled non-torture interrogators from FBI were getting more out of Al-Qaeda detainees than the CIA guys in white coats who took over then with their manuals.
Yeah, that's right. So therefore, torture...
I can waterboard you 3 times in a day, yes.
So torture is not just a bad thing, it's actually not a very smart thing either. So that's why,
So were you surprised by the backlash you got even from, say, Washington Post, which basically demonized then Amnesty International? And I think said something like, this is why these organizations, which were very well respected, are now losing their stature.
Well, I think Amnesty survived that and is doing very well, which is, I think, a proof that Amnesty was not going beyond its mandate. I think there are times when you need to say things that have to be said. And when you say it first, then it's not very pleasant. And you get some pushback. But eventually, I think history proves you
And you
right.
got attacked personally for that also.
I still get attacked personally for it. It's still a very difficult issue.
Including on how you were compensated at Amnesty.
Yes, and there were lots of stories made up about that.
Right.
Facts were never
I've
put
seen
out.
your lawyer statement.
Yes, facts were never put out properly. And there were people both inside and outside Amnesty who were very angry. I was brought in to bring about change. Another big change which I tried to bring into Amnesty was moving Amnesty towards a more holistic approach to human rights, economic and social rights, as well as political and civil rights. There was a lot of anger about that. So I guess they all decided, well, this is payback time. I have not spoken out against Amnesty because I think it's a great organization. It needs our support, and it is still important and valid. And I hope Amnesty will continue to do the work it has to do, but with support.
Let's come back to the Indian situation.
Yes.
In our country last year, Amnesty was confronted with sedition cases because it held a conference in Bangalore with victims of human rights abuses, or quote-unquote human rights abuses from Kashmir. Were you surprised by that? You think it's par for the course?
I didn't actually follow that because I'm no longer in Amnesty, and I want to give space to Amnesty.
I know, but you are in the
for
human
their
rights
case.
community.
Yes. So I didn't actually follow those cases so closely. So it's
I
hard
won't
for me
say
to
the
comment.
doyen, I would say the dean of the human rights community out of South Asia.
No, I haven't followed those cases closely, so it's hard for me to respond to exact cases. But I think there is always globally, the human rights defenders, and I define that in a broad sort of way, including journalists as well, because they are media, an open media, free media is part of the human rights movement. They come under attack. You talked about Bangladesh, and editors and journalists have come under attack. Sometimes physical editors actually get off lighter because they're very prominent.
But the reporters,
but the poor
in fact,
reporters
even
on the
newspaper
ground,
vendors get hit.
Yeah, and the correspondents who are out in the field, they get attacked for trying to put out what they see as the truth. And nowadays, we have got this new term coming into being, fake news, which...
In our country, they say prostitute.
So you don't even know what is true and what is not as a reader. So it's a very complex world into which we are moving into. And human rights, when I look back to 2001 and what was happening then, in many ways it seemed simple. One knew what to do now. It's much, much harder now.
So does the human rights community also need to make changes in its thinking? I'll take you further on this. We had this incident of an army officer tying a person who he said was a stone thrower, although there are doubts, questions about that, tying him on the top of his jeep and driving that jeep through the village with the presumption that nobody would throw stones at him and by implication to his convoy as well. The answer to that is, but don't soldiers have human rights?
Well, if you take a prisoner like that...
It's not my answer.
No. But if you take a prisoner, of course, everyone has human rights. You know, we were just talking about terrorists and whether terrorists have human rights. Of course, they have human rights. But what you get over here is not so much protecting the rights, but when people see something wrong happening, people react to it. So if you take a prisoner, tie him up, take him off like that, you know, people can get angry about it. So that is quite different from protecting human rights. Everyone has human rights, and human rights have to be protected. And I think an army officer who's accused of violating someone's right has the right to a fair trial, has a right to be able to put his case forward, and has a right to do his job. So guidelines for him have to be clear. This system of accountability has to be clear, because otherwise you get the other situation where police and soldiers won't act because they'll be too scared to move. So you need to have a system.
So you need that balance.
You need a balance, and you need transparency. I think the real problem that happens in many, many countries of the world is that the rules are not transparent. So people get suspicious of government gets suspicious of human rights activists, and one of the things we are doing in my organization now, we are an intergovernmental organization, but we work with civil society, we work with law associations, with judiciary, with institutions. One of the things we found is because we can speak to both sides now, we can bring them together. And in many countries we have programs where we are, including in Myanmar, where we are bringing civil society together with local officials and others, together to discuss human rights issues. And that's sort of building bridges, because at the end of the day, what you're looking to do is to build public confidence in the state.
This radical streak among Buddhists, did you see it before, or is it a big surprise to you?
Well,
because that's not the stereotypical impression of Buddhism.
No, and that's why, as you said earlier, I am a secular person too. I think it's wrong to label them as Buddhists in the same way as it is wrong to label the terrorists as Islamic. But don't forget that Cambodia and genocide took place in a Buddhist
But in this case,
country.
it's happening in the name of Buddhism. Monks are coming out. They are asking for it to be done. Monks are radicalizing Myanmar forces as well.
Yes, but this is not the only country where monks have come out and either stayed silent or condoned.
I mean, we saw some of it in Sri Lanka at one point.
Yes, exactly. So that is why, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone of that religion was like that. And we have to be careful about not tarnishing everyone with the same brush, because you want the community to tell their leaders, you're wrong, that's not what we are like, you're not speaking in my name. But if you tarnish them with the same brush, then it becomes very hard for the community then to stand up and say, this is not us.
So, before we conclude, on the more regional issue, the Rohingyas, what are you telling Mr. Modi, what are you telling Sheikh Hasina, and what are you telling Aung San Suu Kyi?
Well, neither of those three leaders are within my hearing distance. But I would say to Aung San Suu Kyi that she has the power.
I promise you they all watch it. They all watch Walk the Talk.
I would tell Aung San Suu Kyi that you have the key in your hands. You have the power to influence your people in the same way that you have shown tolerance and others have stood up for you. I hope that you will now stand up for the Rohingyas and help to find a humanitarian and an appropriate, a right solution for them back in their own country. And to the other two leaders, I would say, while that problem is being solved, be generous and patient. People, if they have an opportunity to go back home, do go back home. So please give them asylum while they are here.
Yeah. And to Mr. Modi in particular, does he worry about these Rohingyas being infested? They're all negative terms, but infested, impregnated, infiltrated by really bad guys, by radical Islamic militants who could harm India.
Yes, I think, as I said earlier, you know, there are processes. India is a country with the rule of law. You have judicial processes, you have administrative processes, and use those processes properly to find out who really is a threat to India and who's not.
And go on that basis.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, this rhetoric that's now built up?
Well, I think we should all do everything we can to calm the rhetoric down, because it's no good to anyone.
Well, I think this conversation will help do that.
Good.
Irene, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I think we'll keep hoping for government to follow the rule of law, but we need people like you to keep an eye.
Well, I'm hoping India will become a member of IDLO.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.